Hello and welcome back to The Rise and Fall of the Chill Out Room, a history of ambient house from 1989 to 1996. Starting 1995 at last, and I'm going to start it in an unconventional way by not properly talking about ambient music. To return to the Matt Annis Red Bull article I quoted at the start of the first video in the series, the following section, and I know quoting this much probably goes against fair use, but honestly it's all relevant. This gives an idea of the tone of 1995. I definitely noticed things changed during a sharp size. Having been a very busy DJ throughout the 90s as the chill out room guy, the chill out room definitely turned into either the drum and bass room or the slower house music room or hip hop or latterly disco. It was another alternative dance room and that's what people wanted. They didn't want beanbags. Mixmaster Morris too had noticed a change. I felt things fading around 95. I was away all summer and when I returned to England it felt like something had changed. There was a deliberate move to stop having ambient rooms. It seemed to be due to the sheer pressure of DJs wanting to play four-to-the-floor dance music. There were so many of them that they ended up taking over every room. Chill out had become tarnished as a term, partly due to the rising number of major label-backed compilations filling record shop shelves. The sound's commercial appeal was, ultimately, its downfall. During the mid-1990s, the major labels got their act together, meaning that smaller independent labels that had been championing the sound didn't get any press or radio anymore, Mixmaster Morris laments. After that point, small labels couldn't have the impact that they had in the early days. Back in the early 90s, the majors didn't want to deal with ambient or techno music at all, and once that changed, it was a problem for the scene. The mainstream just said, we don't want to play with you anymore. The same happened with jungle. Perhaps though, it was just that ambient house, like so many genres before or since in the fast-changing world of electronic music, had simply run its course. I think like any scene, there were 2 years where it fired on all cylinders, Kevin Folks says. That's when all the classic releases were made, and the events were at their most vibrant. Ambient house was at its peak between 91 and 94. By 93 you had Mo Wax arriving on the scene and the beginning of the trip-hop explosion. At the same time jungle was coming out of hardcore. By 96 or 97 the scene had changed again with big beat, post-rock, super clubs and so on. Jimmy Corti was predictably a little blunter about the demise of ambient house when interviewed by another RBMA journalist. Modern chill out was accidentally invented in the late 80s at my house in Stockwell, and it quickly followed the well-trodden route from the underground to the overground, he said. In the following couple of decades it spawned much self-indulgent knob-twiddling nonsense. Ultimately, Guru Josh was probably right. It was boring. The number of records I'm covering in 95 is only slightly more than half of those in 94. Some of the big artists were by this point heading in very different territories. In one of the 1994 videos I already mentioned FSOL's June 95 Essential Mix and its complete lack of anything resembling ambient, instead focusing on dub, funk, trip-hop and psychedelic rock. Similarly, Virgin's Ambient compilation series launched an all-out attack on the ambient house scene in the liner notes of its fourth volume, Isolationism, ironically picking out FSOL as one of the worst offenders somehow. 95 really was the year the Ambient compilation became eclipsed by the Cash-In compilation. Not all of these were bad in the sense of low quality music, although certainly some were, but more using the term ambient to sell to a now very mainstream audience willing to pick up anything with the word ambient on it, despite often containing nothing of the sort. Many so-called ambient compilations from 95 were collections of trip-hop and down-tempo music without any material intended to create sonic space needing for creating or complementing atmosphere. The word had lost all meaning, and all that was needed to sell a compilation of electronic music not designed for nightclub play was to call it ambient something, and put a Buddha statue on the front. Yes, so many of these have a fucking Buddha statue on the front. The something didn't even need to make sense following the word ambient, so we get a journey into ambient groove, ambient ceremony, ambient extractions, a journey into ambient groove phase 2, ambient nation, ambient northern lights, ambient rituals, subtitled Exercise 1 Music for Soul Braiding, ambient techno mania, ambient time travellers, ambient voids, techno ambient, techno nights, ambient dawn, the ambient groove, the future sound of ambient, ironically all older tracks that sounded nothing like the ambient of 95 and beyond. This series very quickly developed into psytrance. The future sound of jazz, ambient electronic abstract digital jazz volume 1, transambient, transambient 2000, music for coffee shops, And of course these sorts of compilation that will be familiar to anyone who frequented record shops in the late 90s, like The Deep and Slow, a collection of 12 chill out tracks. Chill Out, the album. Ibiza After Hours. Look, there's some good material on plenty of these, but very few contain anything anyone into the genre for more than 5 minutes would actually need to spend money on them, and a depressing number barely contain any ambient at all. Over the past 10 or so years there have been numerous attempts in the media to hype up a so-called ambient revival. This never taken off because ambient never went away. In the underground electronic music, now flourishing thanks to the internet, ambient is one of the most prolific types of music around. But it's these exact compilations that killed ambient for anyone outside of that underground. When a journalist writes about an ambient revival, what they actually mean is that these compilations are now long enough ago for it to no longer be embarrassing to say you like ambient music. There was also the rise in artists doing pretty much the same thing in an attempt to either popularise their existing music or simply cash in by making chill out tracks. Don't trust an album from 1995 with ambient in the title, it'll be crap or it won't be ambient at all. Bass Forest's Ambient Bass. Ambient Theology by Ambient Theology. Yes, that is a Christian ambient album. Bass Waves, Liquid Bass, Ambient Capsule 1. Gies, The Ambient Room. Enos, Chill Out Sector. The New Age Dolphin takeover also finally happened in '95, albums like Dolphin Flow, Dolphin Fantasy, and Dolphins Talk to You. Sorry, they don't unless you're John C. Lilly. Ambient continued to appear in library music collections like Ambient Grooves and Dub, while there was further seemingly disingenuous music with the likes of Matter Energy Spacetime's MEST, which found itself reissued as Ton Copernal's Electronic Ambient Grooves Volume 1. There wasn't a Volume 2, and it wasn't ambient. And then just the rise in either bad ambient, new age, trance and space rock with ambient leading territories, with abysmal artwork and pseudo-spiritual titling that was, on the surface at least, aimed at the market. Vibe Tribe, Afterlife, The Journey. Citizen Z, Countdown to the Continuum. Spiral Realms, Crystal Jungles of Eos. Elysium, Dance for the Celestial Beings. The Sonic Voyagers, Endless Mission. Genetic Drugs, Karma Club. Norman, Mr. Magic's Night Flight. Vulse, Inside. Meanwhile, Virgin continued their ambient series not with compilations but a series of artist albums, none of which even pretended to flirt with the idea of ambient techno. Picking up where the fourth volume of the compilations left off, Paul Schutz's Apart is brilliant, but a world away from what one might expect from a major label ambient record at the time. Schutz's music is always difficult to define, but Apart is an album where he delves deepest into his jazz interest, effectively a sinister, murky ambient fusion record, Miles Davis's late 60s sound playing at the other end of a cave. Disc 2 is pure dark ambient drone. Techno Animal's re-entry is great, but its mix of ambient and industrial dub is an odd choice for the so-called ambient series. Despite a cover and title suggestive of ethno-fusion ambient, Sufi's Life's Rising is jazzy vocal trip-hop. Can't help think that Virgin found themselves with their ambient imprint, and being one of the first to see the tides turning, really didn't know what to do with it, so just used it for anything electronic but not dance. It's really quite bizarre. Amazingly, the ambient series continued right through to 1997, with its final release being a compilation featuring, among others, The Beach Boys and Merzbow. All of this content effectively acted to make the more discerning listener actively avoid ambient, which is ironic, but such is the way of music trends. And of course it was easy for them to avoid ambient because IDM properly took off in '95. If Autechre started the year with Garbage, an EP of material bridging the windy expanses of Amber and the group's third album, then it was that album itself that ensured they'd remain dislocated from the term ambient in the future. Actually, Repetae is an album dripping in atmosphere. From the metallic coloured sleeve and mechanical constructions in the artwork to the music itself, relentlessly repetitive pieces of chugging and clanging, the sound of an automated mechanical factory left to make its own music for the rest of eternity, it's a transitional album for the group, one that abandons the sounds of ambient but retains much of its language. For those who find the pair's later works too inaccessible and experimental, and equally for those who find their earlier material too straightforward or uninteresting, there are numerous cut-off points, but Repetae appears to be the most common crossover. Somewhere around 1999's EP7 is probably the other. By abandoning conventional drum machine sounds, Booth and Brown inadvertently set the template for a vast chunk of the next decade's IDM with this album. I don't think I have a favourite Autechre record. It used to be Amber, then it all became a bit jumbled with Incunabula and Draft 7.3 popping their heads in, and Untilted's easily my most played in recent years, but I'm leaning towards Try Repetae these days. In one of the record's two genuinely ambient moments, Stud features a stunning outro that gradually drifts into a hugely enveloping reverb, and this is one of the band's most quietly brilliant and understated moments. The Garbage EP, by the way, contains one of the few beatless Autechre tracks, the breathtaking Vlet remix, which is a must-hear. For Spanners, Black Dog took a step further away from an ambient scene they're only tangentially connected with, creating an album of whimsical breakbeats and mangled funk. In addition to the dub and ethnic elements of his previous solo album, Richard H. Kirk's The Number of Magic incorporated hip-hop drums, jazz and funk samples, and elements of the ambient textures becoming popular at the time. Seefeel's second album, Succour, picks up from 94's Stare-Through EP and dives deeper into the dark ambient and rattling metallic percussion sounds. No longer audibly the work of a guitar band at all, the album instead occupies a similar space to Aphex's second Ambient Works album, especially in its few rhythmic tracks. For his two 1995 EPs, Beaumont Hannant drops the murky ambience entirely, opting instead for punchy electro beats, pounding acid techno and crunchy instrumental hip-hop. Freeform appeared in 95, first with an EP on Scam and then a debut album as the first original release for Ambient Soho's Worm interface, the first signifier that the shop name and the label's direction would be very different, with beats alternately crunchy and clicky, often within the same track, and intricately programmed ever-changing synth melodies. Elastic Speakers takes its cues from Anvil Vapor, Autechre's 1995 EP accompanying Try Repetae, that takes the sound of that album and strips the atmosphere, leaving a drier, more immediate sound. Daryl Fitton released his first EP as Bola, occupying very similar territory. The first Aphex twin album not to bear the Selected Ambient Works name was released, and although probably the Warp release with the most ambient crossover that year, it still largely trades its atmospherics for a more personal approach, with a mixture of down-tempo trip-hop drum loops and human evocative melodies. Meanwhile, Ventolin, Come On You Slag, Start As You Mean To Go On and Wax the Nip mine the last remnants of his early crunchy era, the latter two of those containing some of his most evocative ambience above the harshness. The cover's self-portrait was a direct attempt at moving away from the abstract facelessness of the early 90s. With a mix of down-tempo drum loops and playful melodies, Mike Paradinas' Kid's Spatula album, Spatula Freak, contains some gorgeous tunes. Cough is a career highlight, but occupies very much the same territory as I Care Because You Do when it comes to style. However, it was Aphex, along with Luke Vibert and his work as Plug, who would really define much of the future of IDM with some other 1995 releases. If artists like Autechre and Freeform were paving the way for one direction IDM would take, then a slightly shorter-lived but more visible form developed in the second half of the year. Drill and bass, named after snare rolls so fast they end up sounding like drills, another daft name that got out of hand, has its roots in Luke Vibert's 3 Plug EPs. Jungle had grown out of hardcore in parallel with the rise of ambient, and as previously noted by Jonah Sharp and Kevin Folks earlier, was a major sound by 95, often taking the place of the chill-out room. The earliest form of drum and bass, Jungle sound, was sped-up breaks, and was still a very underground DIY scene, producers with no formal training only needing a couple of samplers and some second-hand funk records to create new tracks. As the style developed, it gradually became more complex and sophisticated, and drew in other musicians interested in cutting-edge electronic music. Vibert was the first to basically say, okay, what if I mess around with this and make it utterly bonkers? His first 2 Plug EPs came out on Rising High. He was still working with the label as Wagonchrist at this point. And while Visible Crater Funk offers a drier and, yes, more funky sound, with elements of electro in there, it's rebuilt Kev that fully goes for it. Military Jazz is almost a manifesto for the style, mangling and re-triggering the track's main break, until at times the whole thing is a little more than a harsh stuttered noise, the drill and bass. What makes the Plug EP stand out from later drill and bass pioneers, and arguably the reason they're not quite as well remembered, is that they still clearly speak the language of jungle. Familiar breaks, booming sub-bass, tons of jazz samples. This is still jungle, it's just Photech on steroids. It's Vibert going, okay, I've taken it as far as I can, who wants to try going further? Richard D. James answered the question with the Hangable Auto Bulb EP in October 95. Released on the same day as music's major label In Pine Effect, it almost single-handedly turned that album and I Care Because You Do's whimsical down-tempo IDM approach into a dead end. Surgically removing all of the jungle from drill and bass, it took these sped up breakbeats and clinical editing and triggering of the plug sound and applied them to a bunch of tracks which were alternately funny, emotional and baffling. This isn't music to dance to, it's there to sit back and boggle at how incomprehensible it sounds, and then enjoy the melodies. James knows how to write a good tune and he's on fine form with tracks like Laughable Butane Bob and Every Day, the last from December's Hangable Auto Bulb EP2. But again, this is personal sounding music. From now on, IDM would be more likely to sound like it wanted to be your mate, playful, whimsical, joyful or sad, rather than launch you into space or take you through a humid rainforest. Anyway, there's a whole video about everything ambient music wasn't in 1995. But that's not to say there was none around. It wasn't quite over yet, and ambient house and ambient techno had their last hurrah in 95 with a handful of classics thrown in for good measure. I will be starting to look at those next week. In the meantime, I would love to hear your thoughts on this video and the music I discussed in it. I'd love to hear from people who were there at the time and watch the sounds develop and change, skew away from the more obvious ambient sounds. Was it even something discussed or notable or even noticed at the time? There are also like, subscribe and share buttons you might also want to press as well. And I will see you next time for some actual ambient.